Chapter 22 of Workers Together. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Workers Together, or an Endless Chain, by Pansy. Chapter 22. An Unexpected Passenger. But he settled the question that day. It was done quietly enough to all outward seeming, though he sat in a conspicuous seat, surrounded on all sides by worshippers. They saw nothing beyond the ordinary taking place. Yet there occurred at that time and place one of those miraculous experiences which have been going on for thousands of years, although we are wont to say that the age of miracles is past. During that brief hour in which the minister preached and the choir sang, and the worshippers listened or joined, the momentous question as to where Robert Parks meant to spend his eternity was settled. Yet there was no sound of trumpet, or roll of drum, or shout of triumph here on earth. There were those beside him who were complacent over their summer toilets, and thought of nothing else, during the 10 minutes in which the decision was made. There were those in front of him who continued the mental operations of buying and selling, and counting gains. There were those near him who were asleep, and there was joy in heaven among the angels. As for Hester Mason, she was gratified beyond measure with her success in getting young Parks to give up his Sunday excursion and go with her to church. She felt virtuous over it. She believed that she was keeping the Sabbath better than she had in a long time. By no means so well trained as Robert, she even fancied that she had made a slight advance step towards being ready for that dread moment of which Miss Mason had spoken, though she hoped and believed it was far off. She made sundry resolutions as to her future living, and then resolved not to spoil the brightness of the day by thinking about such solemn things any longer, and gave her attention to Nettie Goldwyn's new bonnet. That young lady sat just in front of her, and afforded her active mind a fruitful theme. She decided that the bonnet was unbecoming, and that if she had as much money as the Goldwyns, she would see whether she would come to church in such a fright as that. So she who had been one of the instruments used in setting at work forces that would re-echo through all eternity, thought no more about her own soul than she would have done had she been one of the lovely colors in the rainbow-tinted window, to which she next turned her attention. You will notice that it was not simply blind chance which was at work that day, else why did not chance do as much for her as it did for the young man at her side? Certainly, if Dr. Everett could have had the ordering of events, the very last person whom he would have chosen as likely to have the smallest influence for good on the young man for whom he was praying would have been this girl whom God used. He still dreaded her influence more than that of any other person. So much for man's wisdom. Meantime, Austin Barrows on the Sunday excursion train waited for his traveling companion, and received instead a note which read thus: Barrows, my boy, I have been waylaid and captured. The little girl I decided to bring with me is determined to smuggle me off in another direction. She has a fit of the blues, has been to Sunday school, and the lesson was particularly lugubrious, or else the teacher was. Anyway, she has been thrown off the track, and has pulled me with her. I am the more willing to change my plans, because I know the change would please my mother. She is worth pleasing, and I don't do it very often nowadays. Sorry I coaxed you to go, old fellow. I felt more like it last night than I do this morning. But I presume that you will have a grand time, and I'll stay at home and be good for both of us. Parks. Austin Barrows read this hurriedly scribbled note twice through, then twisted it with restless thumb and finger into every shape which he could contrive, whistling meanwhile, in that absent-minded way which would have told a close observer that he was not thinking of the tune he whistled, nor of anything else connected with his present surroundings. In truth, he was thinking of that note. The first feeling was one of indignation. Sunday excursions were not in his line. He had never been to but one before, and Robert Parks had been the moving force at that time as well as now. He would not have thought of going but for the pressure which had been brought to bear upon him, and now to be deserted by the very one who had insisted on his going, merely because the girl whom he had invited chose to show her influence over him, was, he thought, a very strange way of being treated. Little he cared for any young lady's blues. It would have made no difference had he known it was Hester Mason. She was a gay, pleasant girl, and he liked well enough to chat with her, but he would not have given up an excursion on her account, nor have been influenced in any way by her fancies. He felt himself ill-used, but this was not, after all, what left the shade on his face. There was one sentence in the scrawl which he was still twisting that clung to him. "It would please my mother, and she is worth pleasing." It so happened that Austin Barrows had a mother whom this day's work would not please. None knew it better than himself. He knew it would hurt to her heart's core. So sensible had he been of this fact that it was what had made him hesitate longest under Parks's urging. He had said nothing about her, but he had sturdily borne up against the pressure as long as he felt able. And here was Parks flaunting the desire to please his mother in his face. He believed in his heart that his mother was better worth pleasing than 20 mothers such as Robert Parks boasted. He was at this moment on the way to the very town where she lived, and although he had not seen her for 2 months, and really longed for a glimpse of her, he had resolved not to go around to the little house today, for fear of giving her pain. He meant to return on the evening train, and he pleased himself with the thought that he could have a day of pleasure and rest, and not burden her conscience with the sin of it. Mind you, Satan did not let him know that he was ashamed to meet his mother. He was merely tender-hearted, and did not want to grieve her. He told himself also that he had not time to go around to mother's. It was a long walk, and he had promised Parks to go to the garden concert, and then to drop in at the cathedral and hear the great organ, and then to call on a friend of his. A nice quiet Sabbath it was to be, after all. Where was the harm? He whistled and thought about it. But Parks had deserted him. What was he to do with the day now, after the famous garden concert, the ostensible reason for getting up the excursion, was over? "I'll get in an hour for mother, after all," he muttered. "She will be so glad to see me that she will forget how I got there, perhaps." Still he did not believe that, and fell to wondering how he should answer her questions, how she would look, and if he would give her more pain than pleasure. In no pleasant mood, twisting restlessly in his seat, he said to himself, "What's the reason that a fellow can never have any fun, I wonder, without something coming in to spoil it? I believe I am a fool. Why can't I just go on with my day as I had planned it? I'm not bound to be miserable just because Parks has made a fool of me. He needn't lug in his mother, that's just an excuse. Precious little he thinks of her, by the way he goes on. I'm sure I write to mother every 2 weeks, and I spare every copper that I can for her. He owned up to me once that he never sent any money home. He needn't talk. It isn't often I take any pleasure, I'm sure. I don't see any harm in taking a little holiday like this, when a fellow has to work as hard as I do. People who have plenty of money, and all the time they want, can afford to be squeamish. Mother isn't a man, and she can't know how a fellow feels tied up all the time. She just sits there in that chair. What does she know about the world? I need the change and rest." One would have thought it would have puzzled the irate young man to know with whom he was arguing. There certainly seemed to be a conflicting party whose views irritated him. He took the morning paper from his pocket and tried to read it. That would seem more respectable than whistling. In the course of time he began to be aware that there was a good deal of running through the car by conductor and brakeman, and presently by some of the passengers. Something somewhere must be wrong. Yet the train was whizzing along at its usual rate of speed. He lowered his paper and took a view of his traveling companions. It was a curious thing that he had taken a seat in a car where every face was unknown to him. But Austin Barrows was by no means well acquainted in the city where he was employed, and the young people in the next car with whom he was on speaking terms were each accompanied by ladies, so he had felt out of place. This was, by the way, another grievance. He had not known that Robert Parks meant to invite any lady to accompany him. Nothing had been said about such an intention the evening before, when all the plans had been made. On the whole, it cannot be said that our young man's arrangements for a day of pleasure were the most inviting in the world. And now, to add to his discomfiture, was this vague sense of something being wrong. The passengers seemed to be, like himself, restless, excited about something. They kept turning their heads in the direction of the rear car, seemingly watching for some development. "Is anything wrong?" Austin asked of the young man who occupied the seat in front of him, but who was turned around, gazing at the door, with so expectant and so grave an air that he felt justified in asking the question. "There is a fellow in the next car that they think is dying," he said gravely. "Dying?" repeated Barrows aghast. "What a place to die in! What is the matter with him?" "I don't know, a fit or a faint, or something of that kind. They say he won't get over it. He looks awful. The conductor telegraphed to Chester for a doctor to be at the station, but they say he won't live until the train gets in. They've been running through the train for a doctor, but there ain't none. Then they tried for a minister, but that sort ain't often found on the cars this day of the week." Nothing more full of distress than young Barrows's face can be imagined. "Did the man want to see a minister?" he asked in a low awe-stricken tone. "No, poor fellow, he wants his mother, that's all he thinks about. He keeps asking for her. He's young, not older than you or I, and she isn't far off, only down here in Chester, they say. But she might as well be 1,000 miles off for all he'll ever have of her, I guess. But it is kind of decent to have a minister around at such a time, you know. He ought to have something said to him, I s'pose. You see, he comes to a little, and then goes off again into another faint. They telegraphed the Reverend Dr. Holden to meet the train at Chester. Yes, he did ask for a minister the last time he roused. At least he wanted somebody to pray, but not one could be found. The fact is, the praying folks all stay at home today. I wouldn't have thought of looking for one on the cars. I wouldn't want a body that rode on the cars on Sunday to pray for me if I was dying, would you?" But young Barrows was too much distressed for even such grave moralizing as this. His informant was grave enough, chewed the end of his cane thoughtfully, and seemed deeply impressed with the sadness of the whole thing. But the arrow in his words that pierced Barrows's heart was found in the sentence, "He wants his mother." "I'll go straight down to mother's," he muttered, "as soon as ever I get off the train." Chapter 23.